Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. This podcast explores how authors create a world that we can escape into. Join me as we demystify the magic that keeps us turning the page. I spoke with Lee Carpenter about her latest novel, Ilium, a spy thriller with a twist. As Carpenter pointed out to me in our fascinating interview, most people who commit espionage can be defined by the acronym MICE, M-I-C-E, which stands for money, ideology, coercion, or ego. Carpenter thought, what if it's not any of those? What if it's something different? What if it's for love? The young woman in Carpenter's novel lives in London, is stuck in her life, her job. She's looking for a bit of adventure, wishing she were someone else. As the saying goes, be careful what you wish for. On the eve of her 21st birthday, she meets a dashing older American man. They fall in love, marry, and only then does she discover she's unwittingly become the asset in a long overdue, simmering, high-stakes CIA Mossad covert op. By the way, we never learned the protagonist's name, a fact I didn't realize until I'd finished this clever book. Carpenter is sparing with what she tells the reader, revealing more and more as we approach the dramatic climax. Like her hero, John le Carré, Carpenter is not just a master of espionage, she's also a master of the written word. In our Q&A, we confirm that Carpenter is not a spy. I wasn't sure, I had to ask. Like she'd tell me, right? We touch on several points, that Ilium was inspired by le Carré's Little Drummer Girl, Homer's The Iliad, a series of paintings by Cy Twombly, and a real-life spy operation that went horribly wrong. The book moves from London to Majorca to Cap Ferret, a sandy peninsula in southwestern France. Her book is just 214 pages with a beginning, middle, and an end. But in those 214 pages are layers and themes that stick with you. How revenge can take time in these so-called forever wars. The cyclicality of violence. How the same people capable of murder are also capable of empathy and love. And in terms of advice for would-be novelists, Carpenter says it's simple. Just read your favorite authors. Read, read, read. I hope you enjoy the show. I really, really enjoyed Ilium.
Thank
I haven't read a book like this in maybe since John le Carré in ages. And I was reading what other people said. And, I don't normally read spy novels. I used to when I was young. But recently, I read, women's fiction more. And so this was such a nice change. But it also has a lot of things that are very interesting as a woman, which is what I loved about the book, the way you have two things going on, which was so much more interesting. It wasn't just this flat male spy thing. It had a lot of psychological, I guess John le Carré did too, but anyway.
I had spent a lot of time in COVID working with a guy called Stephen Cornwell, who Stephen and his brother Simon Cornwell run a production company in London and LA called Ink Factory. And they are the sons of David Cornwell, otherwise known as John le Carré. And they adapt all of the le Carré books into film and television projects. So if you've seen any le Carré adaptation, it was run through the Ink Factory.
Fantastic.
And they're terrific. But what happened to me working with them was they talked so much about their father, which is to say they talked about what they were working on. And I realized that I had never read John le Carré. I really started reading him at the start of COVID. In fact, the first book that I read right after lockdown was The Little Drummer Girl. And I went on to read everything he wrote. I read his biography. I read his letters. I was so amazed that I'd never encountered him and that what he was doing was something so interesting to me, and something I've tried to do in my work since I started doing this, which is to take genres and try and do them a little bit differently. And then, sadly he died while I was still working on that project. And so then this sort of tsunami of reflections and obituaries came out, many written by, some of our finest living writers, and they all said a variation on the same thing, which is Carey was not just a master of espionage. He was a master of the written word. He was although he kind of consciously set himself aside from what I would call sort of the literary world. He was in it, and I so admire him. So anything that remotely reminded you of Le Carre in this book, I'll take as a huge compliment.
It was a great book. He was a great writer, and so are you. Anyway, Ilium is a literary spy novel, much in the vein of, as we were discussing, John le Carre and Graham Greene, who I also love. Its style is spare, restrained, letting the reader know what's going on little by little until the very end of the book, when it all becomes clear. It's also a love story about a young British woman who doesn't really know who she is, wants a bit of adventure and excitement in her life, and then, in the classic case of be careful what you wish for, falls for a dashing older American spy and becomes the perfect asset in a long overdue covert special op. For those who haven't read the book, Lee, can you give us a brief synopsis of it?
Sure. Well, that was an excellent synopsis you just gave. I would just add that, yes, I went to Langley, our CIA headquarters, when I was researching my last book. And when I was there, the person who gave me my tour said, Lee, women don't write espionage. He might have even said women can't write espionage. And he really wasn't, being a jerk. He was sort of pointing out something that he just thought was objectively true. But that really got me interested in this question of, what is espionage and what is female-centered espionage? And I've had many, many meetings that never went anywhere on film and television projects where the same question comes up, which is, where is a female James Bond? Where is a female Jason Bourne? As you quite rightly point out, the two sort of masters of the genre, at least the Cold War era of the genre, when it was very much born in a new way, were Graham Greene and John le Carre. Ian Fleming's doing something different, but he's of a piece with these guys, all of whom served in intelligence. So anyway, it's a very long prelude to answering your question, which is, I knew I wanted a woman at the center of this story. And I knew I wanted a story of an operation that takes time, that is not something planned on a Tuesday and executed on a Friday, but I open, on page 1, kind of taking the reader to the 1-yard line where the final piece of the puzzle, which is this young woman, is put into place. And once they have her, and you find out at the end of the book why she was chosen, they can begin an operation which she at first doesn't know she's involved in. Once she's involved in it, she doesn't really know what it is. And by the time she realizes how dangerous it is, she's too deeply committed to step away. That is not the usual story of an asset. The usual story of the asset is they're developed, they're recruited, they're often very well paid, and they really go into something knowing at least a portion of what they're doing. And I thought it would be interesting not only to have an asset who really didn't know what she was doing, but to have an asset who took the job, so to speak, not for money, not for ideology, not for ego. I mean, in the espionage real world, it's often said that the reason people will commit espionage can be defined by this acronym MICE, M-I-C-E. And MICE stands for money, ideology, coercion, and ego. That broadly speaking, those are the 4 reasons why people are willing to commit espionage. And I thought, what if it's not money, ideology, coercion, and ego? What if it's love? What if she says yes because the person who asks her is not only someone she loves, but her husband, and not only her husband, but her husband who's asking her at a very vulnerable time in his life. And that was really the way to sort of, for me, enter the genre a little bit differently. And I also found, certainly in John le Carre's work, in most of his books, the point of view is the point of view of the handler or the officer, not the point of view of the asset or the person recruited and dropped into the mission. And the one book in which he does get quite into the asset's point of view is The Little Drummer Girl, where you have a female asset, also British. And that book was a big, big inspiration for me in wanting to take this woman on a journey. So even if you don't like any of the spy stuff that I tried to drop into the novel, that at the end, as you say, it's really her journey into understanding something about herself.
I read that part of the inspiration was, and you sort of touched on this, the case of William Buckley.
Yes.
Can you tell us about him?
Sure. Yes, there was, in fact, another William Buckley, far less well known, very well known in the spy world. And I'll try to explain why. But this William Buckley was our CIA station chief in Beirut in the 80s. And he was kidnapped, tortured, and assassinated. And that was a huge breaking of the code of the sort of international espionage game. If there was a code, it could be defined in one line, which is we don't kill our own. I have friends who are career intelligence officers who were serving in Germany at the same time that Vladimir Putin was a young, at that time, KGB officer in Germany. It's sort of like, the head of Goldman Sachs and the head of JP Morgan are competitors, but they're in the same game. They're in the same business and probably have a level of cordiality and mutual respect. They've been in the same industry. The same, generally speaking, was and to some extent still remains true of spies. They tend to all know each other. Certainly if you're serving in a war zone or one of our major cities, they all know who one another are. And the code was, we don't kill other spies. Yes, everyone carries out targeted assassination campaigns, but the head of MI6 is not going to order a hit on a KGB officer. Or that was the idea until that time. I didn't know this. This was explained to me. So the taking of Buckley was a breaking of that norm and resulted in a big sea change in the espionage world. Now, that happened, and almost 30 years later, in a car bombing in Damascus, which was a joint CIA Mossad operation, we killed a guy called Imad Mughniya. Imad Mughniya was the leader of Hezbollah, and there were a lot of different reasons that Mossad wanted to target him. But it turned out that Mughniya had a link to the Buckley assassination. And the link was Mughniya, as a very young man coming up in the game, was the one who had kidnapped him and the one who had assassinated him. And so I, having read of the Buckley story and then later learning the Mughniya story, imagined a situation in which the men around Buckley who had been his friends and who knew who had killed him would wait almost their, large part of their lives to avenge that killing. So the book is not exactly based on Buckley and Mughniya, but the idea is that revenge can take time when you are in a sort of forever war. And I started writing the book right around the time the war started in Ukraine. And I remember a lot of people saying at that time, far more sophisticated thinkers on national security than I am, saying, what is this, the Cold War 2.0? Did the Cold War never end? This thing, the Cold War, which had felt so definitively over for most of my life, now seemed not really to have ended at all. And so are we in a period now of redefining what that was? And that was interesting to me too, because I think even if you just look at popular entertainment, there have been incredible movies and TV shows where we've seen the same villains, and they haven't been Russian, right? They've been Middle Eastern, because that's the war that we thought we were fighting. And then the more I dug into these Russian characters, the more I sort of fell in love with them.
I love it. Also, I read that you were inspired with Greek mythology.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? That plays into the title, though, is not so much Greek mythology. It's more a series of paintings.
I had seen a series of paintings by Cy Twombly, a painter I love.
Yeah.
Yes, and These paintings, I don't even remember how I found them, but it's a series of paintings that he did. He calls the series or the cycle 50 Days at Iliam, Iliam, which did not end up being the title of the book because it felt too weird for my publisher, I think. So we reverted to Ilium. This series of paintings is Twombly's depiction of the Trojan War. They're very, very beautiful, but they're, depicting a very brutal and violent thing, which is to say a war, any war. And I remember looking at them and thinking, who would want depictions of a war in their home? And that got me thinking maybe an older warrior who wants to remember the days when he was a young warrior. And what if this older warrior, who in the book, as you know, is an oligarch, had a career in Russian intelligence, had amassed wealth, and so was able to build this essentially small museum on his property where he houses these paintings, and he wants to live among them and he wants to be among them. And again, only at the end of the book do you kind of realize what his whole backstory is. The Iliad is a story that's kind of hung around for me over the last 10 years since I published my first book, which came out 10 years ago. That book, 11 Days, was titled after the 11-day, really 12-day period at the end of the Iliad, where you have the burial of Hector. And I referenced this. I hope it doesn't sound ridiculously pretentious to reference the Iliad, but I hope I did it gently. But near the end of the Iliad, everybody knows the Iliad is a war story, but near the end, what happens is Priam, who's an old man, goes into, at great personal risk, goes into Achilles' camp, into the camp of great warrior Achilles. Achilles had killed his son, Hector, and Priam wants to ask Achilles if he'll give his son's body back. Now, Achilles killed Hector to avenge the death of Patroclus, who was Achilles' best friend, maybe his lover, who Hector had killed. So you have this sort of idea of the cyclicality of violence. And I think it's, we're certainly living with a lot of that today at great cost. But it has always been a hallmark of these long wars. There's a loss and a revenge and a loss and a revenge. And I was kind of interested in the human element there. And what happens when Priam goes to visit Achilles is these two tough guys sit down and basically weep over their losses, Achilles over the loss of his best friend and Priam over the loss of his child. And at the end of that moment of shared grief, Achilles agrees to stand down his army for the period of the burial, and he gives the body back to Priam. And you have this almost like a complete shift in tone in the last 10 pages of the Iliad, where you move away from the killing to this very poignant, burial rite. And this idea that these two men, again, back to people who are in the same industry and therefore can empathize with one another, that always stayed with me. All of these characters in the book have a much, much longer backstory than the one that she, the narrator, understood, even at the beginning.
No, I thought it was really very interesting having a 9-year-old. And you bring up something when you talk about these forever wars, where you said somewhere where we don't really know about this, where they started, when they'll end. And how do you explain this to a 9-year-old boy who may have been born decades after the war or the grudge first happened?
It's interesting only now hearing you put it that way about Felix, this young boy in the book. In a way, that's the definition of his innocence, that he doesn't understand the wars that his own father has fought in and is not yet old enough to raise any questions about them. This family in the book is sort of in hiding, in exile and in hiding in this town in France. And I thought, well, but for him, that's just his life. I honestly didn't think about this until just hearing what you said now. So this was definitely unconscious. My parents had quite a big age difference, and I was born when my father was in his late 50s, and he had served in World War II. And because I was just, a typically narcissistic kid. By the time I was old enough to have an adult conversation with him, by the time I was a teenager, it never occurred to me to say, hey, what was your life like 50 years ago? To me, growing up in the 80s, Vietnam felt like it was a far remove. By the way, it wasn't at all. Now I see, my God, Vietnam had barely just ended. I was born while the war was going on. But when you're young, you don't experience it that way. So I now can look back and say, for my father, his war, he stayed in the military after World War II, but that war was probably never that far away from him. But for me, it felt like something I read about in a history book. I never asked him about what he did then. As you know, that generation was, I think all generations are to a certain extent who serve, but that generation's brand has so much to do with their ethos of discretion. And it was only after he died that I found out quite a bit about what he had done. And so I'm always saying to friends of mine who serve in the military or in the intelligence business, remember your stories, even if you don't write them down, because you may have a child or a grandchild in 20, 30, 40 years who will ask you about it. So I now try and spend as much time as I can with my older friends and ask them, what was your life like 20, 30, 40 years ago? I'm probably always chasing the memory of my father, but I think it's a very natural thing to not ask your parents what their childhood was like. And I think more people should do that. And this little boy in the book, you realize at the end, grows up and kind of gets out of the business, as it were. He goes into another line of work. But I thought the idea that he could carry on a relationship with this woman who comes into his life really to bring his father into the crosshairs becomes a dear, dear friend of his, that it's not the black hats and the white hats anymore. And as you well know, never has been in interesting literature. I think there's always been an element of heroes and villains having more in common than they do with the rest of us.
Definitely. And it makes for a much more interesting book. And real life is like that. Anyway, it's never black and white. This is your third novel about espionage. What have you learned along the way in terms of writing about it?
I never thought I would write. My father always encouraged me to be a writer. And of course, I spent my life trying to achieve other things. And then he died. And I sort of thought, okay, maybe I can write something. I had an agent who was very supportive, who I'd been working on another project with. And anyway, long story short, I really thought, what's the worst that can happen to me? I write a book that no one likes. The critics hate it. It doesn't sell. I make a fool of myself. My father's dead. Suddenly, as is so often the case, it's a cliche, but it really was the case for me. Everything I had achieved or done up until that point suddenly felt completely meaningless. And I felt for the first time in my life ready to take a risk. Because again, what was the worst thing that could happen? So I wrote my first book very earnestly. It was about really set in the Navy SEAL community. And, I was mourning the loss of my dad. I had a newborn, and I was trying to, I think, portray these people as heroes, as so many of them are. And I have a really special relationship with that book because it came first. And then I think I felt pressure with my second book, Red, White, Blue, to sort of look more cynically at these professions. And I think, I wrote the best book I could with Red, White, Blue, but I was still struggling to figure out, what is a plot? I mean, these things sound so simple, but they're just not. A great plot has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the great genre books have beginnings and middles and ends. And I think with Ilium, if I did nothing else, I wrote a book with a beginning and a middle and an end. And I think that the genre tends to be defined by a sense of mission, a sense of something that's propulsive and making you, that's why they call them page turners. And I was really trying to do that with this book. I don't know if I did, but I, much more than my other two books, which are totally nonlinear and very internal and much more, in the case of 11 Days, a young single mother. In the case of Red, White, Blue, a girl who's lost her father. They also have women at the center, but those women are sort of thinking about things that happen to other people. And with this book, I really wanted to like let her have the things happen to her. I mean, it's an interesting challenge that I think I'm not the first female writer to face, which is this idea of allowing a female character to have agency. That why does it have to be the guy who walks in the room and fires the gun? I mean, that's the most extreme sort of hackneyed example, but I think you'll see traditions in even the greatest female fiction of an instinct on the part of the writer to allow the woman to make her passive, allow the woman to be passive. It's related to empathy, as you said before. It's related a little bit to, a sophistication. I won't be the gunslinger. I'll be the female philosopher in the corner commenting on the gunslinger. And in this book, I was just hell-bent on she is going to go somewhere. She's going to do something. I'm not the first one to say it, but character is what someone does. And, you can go all the way back to Oedipus, sleeping with his mother, killing his father, and ripping his eyes out. I mean, those are big choices. Or Michael Corleone, so novels don't have to be that kind of Aristotelian characterization, but I wanted to allow her to try. She's moving into a world of, what I call operational shot callers, people who are making big choices all the time, world-changing choices. And I didn't want her to just float through the world. I wanted her to, as much as I could, again, and I don't know if I achieved it, but I wanted her to become one of them almost by the end of the book.
Yeah, because she doesn't really know what she's in for for a chunk of the book, and she's kind of wanting to leave. I have a question, which is, how did you do your research? Are you a spy?
No.
But do you know a lot of spies, or how did you? It seems so believable.
Thank you. I started after my father died. I started like kind of talking to a lot of people in his generation who had served in these lines of work. And actually, I'm married to another writer who worked at the CIA. But we both say, and it's true. I mean, I don't really use him for my research, but we as a result of that, we have a lot of close friends who were and still are in that line of work. And I just, I love this genre. So like I said, I think reading Jean le Carré was as good, if not better research than sitting down and talking to a number of people who work in the field, because he taught me so much about story. And the rest, so much of the rest is almost Googleable. But I think what makes a book work, again, who knows if this one did, but what makes a nonfiction history of the CIA work is exacting attention to detail. And I'm rereading Tim Weiner's book, Legacy of Ashes, right now, which is really a history of the CIA. And the detail is incredible. And you want detail in a novel too, but I don't think you need it as much as you need to get the emotions right.
Yeah, exactly. So if you were giving advice to a would-be, or not would-be, wannabe espionage writer, would it be less is more, or maybe it's that what you were saying about the story, character as plot?
Yeah, I think it is, read the greats if you're interested in the genre, because it's such a pleasure. I mean, Graham Greene is so terrific, different than le Carré. With Bond, you can read the books or you can just watch the movies. Certainly with Bourne, what Tony Gilroy did in his scripts and in his adaptations of the Ludlum books is incredible. And there's a reason it has persisted, even as so much has changed as a popular form of entertainment. I think that people like to be taken into different worlds, and as long as but in the end, I do think it is the characters that are so defining, and that's why we have these kind of iconic spies that George Smiley comes to mind, but there are many of them that these great writers have left us with. So I would say read read the authors who you love, and just keep reading them, and eventually you develop something approximating your own style.
One thing I also read is that you love your longtime editor who also used to edit Joan Didion. And
Yes.
can you tell us about Joan Didion's feeling about contractions and do you have any other great little tidbits of advice?
Well, she would always say, well, Joan Didion, Joan likes it this way. But I always sort of suspected that really it was Shelley who had given those tricks to Joan Didion. Who knows? But yeah, restraint is a hallmark of her work. There's a cool, exacting way in which she approaches prose that I really admire. My favorite espionage novel is actually a novel that Joan Didion wrote called Democracy, which I think doesn't really sit in the pantheon of espionage books, but I think fits squarely in there. And it's about a young woman who falls in love with an older CIA agent. And it's so Didion-esque that I think people don't put it alongside the Le Carré novels, but it's such an incredible read. And yes, I think that as far as I've understood it from Shelley, who's not only my editor, but my great friend and has taught me so much about tone and restraint, I think that you have certain rules, or Didion had certain rules for fiction and certain rules for nonfiction. I certainly don't write as much nonfiction, but the thing about the contractions, which you mentioned, was that they have no place in fiction. They're better for nonfiction. And Shelley would always say things very gently, Lee, I was thinking about doing this, but we don't have to. But, Didion felt da-da-da. And once, you realize, well, Joan Didion said that was the rule. I mean, what are you going to do? So she really had that, but as the best editors do, I mean, she would edit so lightly and so precisely. And then we'd have these long talks and I'd realize that there was a major muscle movement in the book I needed to change, but she wasn't going to prescribe it to me. She allowed me to discover the things that I was doing or not doing.
Fantastic. Can you tell us what's happening with Ilium in terms of the film rights?
Sure. Ilium was optioned by Alfonso Cuarón, who's a Mexican filmmaker.
Famous one.
Yes. Amazing.
Didn't he win an Academy Award?
He did.
Yeah.
As an Apple TV project, which is great. But, just having been kicked in the teeth a few times in that world, you never know. I mean, you want your book to attach some interesting people, and then sometimes it gets a script and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it goes all the way and sometimes it doesn't. So I have cautious optimism about it, but it certainly was very flattering to have his folks take notice of it.
I remember him literally getting the award, I think. But was it for I thought it was for, was it called Gravity, or the one with Sandra Bullock?
Yes.
That is the one that he got the award for.
I think so, yeah, which was an incredible movie. Yeah.
It was really good.
My memory of the movie was, right, this is a space movie, right? That's a very robust genre, but it's really a movie about loss in the end. And I absolutely loved it.
One thing is, when I'm almost finished with all my questions, but you talk a lot about classic espionage writers. Are there any current espionage writers that you admire or look forward to reading their books?
Yes, there are so many, and I'm not as well-versed on the contemporary espionage landscape, but one writer who I think is absolutely terrific, who's also doing something a bit different with the genre, is Mick Herron, who has been called, by certain British publications, sort of the new John le Carré, but he does something so different. And his books are known as the Slow Horses series. And
oh my God, the TV show is fantastic. Yes. It's my favorite show.
So that is, the TV show is adapted from his novels. And actually the writer of the TV show, who I have met, Will Smith, not to be confused with the actor Will Smith, before he wrote the Slow Horses for Apple, he wrote on Veep. And I teased him when I met him, Will, that's just the same show, because you're writing about I said, in America, our vice presidency is sort of like the Salon des Refugiés. It's looking at all the exiles. But
Funny.
But there again, you have, these great characters and a terrific ensemble and propulsive action, but you don't have, who am I thinking of who played Bond? Well, you don't have like a Daniel Craig at the center, right? You've Gary Oldman. So you have Gary Oldman, eating days old sandwiches and drinking himself into oblivion. And it's
so good.
But he's the smartest guy in the room.
Right.
And that show, to anyone who hears this, who hasn't watched it or read the novels, I recommend them all. Mick Herron, he's a lovely, lovely man. So
fantastic. So the books are as good as the TV.
Yeah, then different. So you can do both. I mean, I watched the show. I'm not totally up to date on the show, and then read the books and absolutely love them.
So my last question is just, what's next? Are you working on another writing project?
I am. I'm working on a play, which I wrote in COVID, which I'm desperately trying to find a theater producer to help me get it to the next level. So I wrote a play. I'm working on that, and I'm just finishing a story collection, which is really an act of, as my father would have said, the triumph of hope over experience, because people don't really read short fiction as much anymore. But I had developed a friendship with the editor of the Swanee Review, which is a fantastic literary magazine, still publishes incredible short fiction. And he said, Lee, you're not crazy. You should write some short fiction. And so over the last 6 years, I've been publishing these stories with him that will become a collection. And the last piece in the collection will be this play that I wrote. So that's the next.
Fantastic.
That's the next thing we'll see. And then, I'm not done with spies. So
good.
Thank you.
I assume another woman, since all your characters have been women.
Yeah, I hope so.
Also, I was curious, are you also a professor of law at Columbia?
Well, I'm bound to say I'm a lecturer in law, because I think if I went around saying I was a professor, this is this very quirky thing, which was in COVID, I started a series of conversations with a friend of mine who was a federal prosecutor in New York in the Southern District. And I was kind of sending her material that I thought was interesting. I was working on an opioid-related project at the time. So I was reading all these cases, basically opening statements in cases that had been prosecuted in West Virginia against these pill mill doctors. And there was one prosecutor who became pretty well known for taking these doctors to task for what they were doing, which was, essentially serial killing people with opioids. And he wrote this opening statement, Elena, that was like as riveting as any first page in a novel I'd ever read. So I sent it to my friend, a lawyer.
Yeah.
And I said, in law school, is there a class where you read just great writing, where it's not constitutional law or tax law, or is there sort of a literature of law class? Anyway, long story short, 3 months later, we're pitching the dean on the idea of this class, which I thought would go nowhere, or maybe we'd teach it one term. And anyway, I just wrapped up my 4th year teaching there, and it's just a totally different part of the world to be in, frankly. And these kids are all so smart, and I learn so much from them. But at the end of every year, I say, I'll never do that again. It was so much work. But it's essentially, we've built a sort of writing curriculum where the students read a combination of legal writing, like say Supreme Court opinions, and then examples of, what I'll call creative nonfiction. And the idea is to teach them storytelling techniques that allow them to build persuasive arguments. Again,
Fantastic.
I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not an expert, but it's an interesting audience, because if I'm able to teach them anything, they're going out and doing it in they're making a difference.
Yeah.
In a way that you feel increasingly, it's hard to make a difference with a book. But these kids all want to go save the world, and they all want to go work in very tough environments, and it's a real privilege to learn from them, frankly.
What's the title of the class?
It's a terribly pretentious title, but I wanted to call it Persuasion, but there's already a class called Persuasion. It's called Truth and Story in the Language of Justice. And the reason that ended up being this very laborious title that Joan Didion would have hated, but no, the reason we landed on that title was that the woman I teach with is the real legal scholar. And she said, we have to really tell them what it is. Otherwise, nobody's going to take it. We have to really call it exactly what it is, and until the class gets a reputation. And so they feel like they're not just taking some gooey creative writing class. These kids are very mission driven, and they want a class that's going to give them a skill set. And I hope we have given them that. But, it all goes back to the basic building blocks of what makes a good story. And I'll just say one last thing on that. There is a very, as you may know, but I did not, very specific way to write that's taught in law school. And it has to do with fact patterns and rationality. And they are essentially taught a form of writing, but it's sort of the opposite of creative writing. And story is a word that's almost a bad word in legal circles. It's like, well, Donald Trump's the guy who gets on the stand and tells a story. It's associated with sort of lies,
I see,
and misdirects and misperceptions. So I'm trying to sort of take back the qualitative elements of story so that these kids feel like, hey, a story can be super powerful. And we bring in, over the course of the term, we bring in at 3 different points, 3 federal judges. And those 3 judges speak to 3 different pieces of story that are involved in any trial. And one is opening statements, and one is sentencing memos, and one is closing statements. And they talk about, in their own experience, why story matters in those contexts. I mean, sentencing memos was something I didn't even know existed. And now I feel like I've really learned how difficult it is to be a judge who essentially at the end of every trial has to tell a story, And so it's, again, huge education for me.
Fascinating. Yeah, I would definitely take it.
You are welcome to come audit at any time.
Well, thank you very, very much. I think people are going to find this interview really interesting.
I'm so grateful for your support.
Oh my God, no, I loved the book.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I think Leah is one of the more informative authors I've spoken to. Who doesn't love learning about the secret world of spies, both in real life and make-believe? My next interview is with best-selling author Anne Leary, whose latest book, I've Tried Being Nice, is really good. Trust me. See you in 2 weeks, and remember to message me on Instagram if you've read something recently that you absolutely loved. Bye.